In today's edition of 2020 Daily Trail Markers, Democratic presidential candidate Beto O'Rourke says that he thinks Americans will hand in their guns if a mandatory buyback law is passed. O'Rourke spoke with CBS News last night in a wide-ranging interview where he also addressed his proposal to end the opioid crisis and help Americans with disabilities. 2020 campaign reporter Tim Perry started by asking him about his goals for the Iowa caucus, and here's what he had to say.
We want to do really well in Iowa. We want to finish in the top of the Democratic contenders here in the state. And we have some hope and confidence that we'll be able to do that based on the feedback that we're getting. We were in Mount Vernon, where you saw us yesterday with 200 people at one of these great town hall events where we're listening to those that we want to serve and asking them to join this campaign. We had a number of commit to caucus commitments made at that event. And we know that this race is still very fluid in Iowa. Those who have chosen a candidate that they like still say that they're open to selecting somebody else. So getting out there, being with those who are going to decide this election, and supporting our amazing grassroots volunteers and the team that we have on the ground in Iowa is our strategy to finish well on caucus night in February.
But where do you need to finish to go forward with the campaign? Because, I mean, that's important. You have to set those benchmarks.
Yeah, we want to finish as close to the top as we can. And making sure that we build on the great work that our team is doing here on the ground, and understanding that caucus goers make their decision relatively close to caucus night.
And so some news of the day question. Former Vice President Joe Biden said that he's going to be changing his stance on accepting super PAC money. Will you ever, under any circumstance, take super PAC money?
No, I don't believe in political action committees, don't believe in super PACs, don't believe that corporations are people and money is speech, and that corporations should be able to spend unlimited amounts of money to influence our democracy and purchase elections. And it's not enough to say that you're against it, you have to walk the talk, and in this campaign we are. All grassroots donations, no corporations, no special interests, no lobbyists, no PACs, and no super PACs. It is the way that we get this democracy back and make sure that our institutions listen to people instead of corporations.
And so what message is he sending to the party by changing that stance and by taking that type of money?
This is a confusing message for America. I think the people of this country are trying to determine who stands on the side of people when it's a choice between people and corporations. By taking PAC money, by organizing a super PAC, it's going to be hard for the American people to know whose side that candidate is on. But we want to make that choice clear, and that's why we're refusing all PAC and super PAC corporate and special interest donations.
I want to switch to guns. You, a few weeks ago, said that Mayor Pete Buttigieg lacked courage for not coming out in support of mandatory assault weapons buyback. And you said that it was offensive that he called it a shiny object. But in a memo, Congresswoman Gabby Giffords said Democratic candidates for president benefit among primary voters by focusing on background checks and not the mandatory buyback of assault weapons. And David Hogg, as you know, a well-known gun control activist, calls it a distraction. Do they too lack courage when they say things like that?
I don't think we should be governed by polls or consultants or focus groups in making important public policy to save the lives of our fellow Americans. March for Our Lives, which actually came out with a proposal for a mandatory buyback as well as universal background checks and extreme risk protection orders, have shown the kind of leadership that we need in this country right now. And none of these solutions are mutually exclusive. It is not as though if you pursue one, you will not have the other. If we're going to reduce the 40,000 gun deaths that we see in America every year, we're going to have to pursue all of these solutions on all of these fronts. But to constrain what we think is possible based on how popular an idea is or how it polls right now defies the kind of leadership that America needs at this moment. We need to be governed not by polls, but by people who are willing to do what is necessary, regardless of its popularity.
But they're not governed. They're more on the activist side. So I would say for those two, would you say that they lack courage for not
No, I wouldn't say that at all. I'm extremely moved by Gabby's leadership on this issue, by David's leadership on this issue. In fact, I just attended a forum that they both hosted on gun violence and reducing gun violence in America. So we will work with anyone, anytime, anywhere to make sure that we address this issue. You're bringing up a criticism that was made by the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, that trying to get AR-15s and AK-47s, weapons of war, off the streets is pursuing a shiny object. For me, for those who've experienced gun violence from these military-style weapons, I think that's a slap in the face. It denies the experience that so many Americans have had and the fear that so many live under, that they too will be the victims of gun violence from one of these instruments of terror. So regardless of the politics of this or how it polls or what other candidates are saying, I'm going to pursue the right thing because it's the right thing to do.
How much do you think a mandatory gun buyback would cost taxpayers? Have you thought about that yet?
I think a mandatory buyback can be financed with a surcharge that would be paid by gun manufacturers, those who are making the AR-15s and AK-47s, and continue to sell them into our communities despite the terror that they've inspired and the lives that they've been taken. I think this is the right way to fund a mandatory buyback without imposing any new taxes on our fellow Americans.
And are you ever concerned that that policy could be too retroactive? You said you're not going to go door to door taking the guns, and it's if people have them out in the open, but wouldn't that be considered retroactive instead of like actually proactively getting the guns off the street?
If we're able to pass mandatory buybacks and I'm able to sign that into law, then I fully expect our fellow Americans to turn in their AR-15s and their AK-47s. For anyone who does not and is caught in possession or seen in possession of one of these weapons of war, one of these instruments of terror, that weapon will be taken from them and they will be fined. And if they should persist in continuing to use and to buy these weapons, then there will be other consequences in the criminal code.
I want to ask you about your opioid plan that you released today. On the debate stage, you said that decriminalizing opioids should be part of the solution. That's not in your plan today that you released. Why not?
It is part of my plan. The first part of our plan talks about removing the stigma of substance use disorder. So anyone who is using an opioid right now, and for most of Americans who are, that use of an opioid began with a legal prescription. I don't want them to fear being arrested or incarcerated or becoming justice involved if they come forward to seek help. And so I think it's very necessary that we make clear that there will be no criminal consequence for possession, for personal use, for doing the right thing and coming forward and trying to get the help, the treatment, and the long-term recovery that someone needs. So that's very much part of removing the stigma around opioid use.
And last question, you recently spoke to the Washington Post about your sister, and she has an intellectual disability. And I know that your campaign at some point will be releasing a plan aimed at some of the Americans who are disabled. How does her story affect how you'll be shaping that plan and that policy?
You know, in my sister Erin's case, we learned when she graduated from high school that she was on an 18-year wait list to get state-supported services in Texas for her intellectual disabilities. And unfortunately, that is not the exception in states like Texas. It is the rule that those with disabilities who want to be able to lead independent lives, who want to be able to work or continue their education or vote or be able to take care of themselves are unable to get the help and the support that they need. Very often forced to rely on family members who are unpaid caregivers. It makes clear to me that we need to make that investment in our fellow Americans who have disabilities, remove the barriers that they have in their lives to accessing health care or the ballot box or being able to get a job and being paid the same minimum wage that anyone else is paid in this country, and that the tens of millions who live with a disability in America are very often overlooked or unheard from. It makes me want to elevate their voices and their cause, and to make sure that we make the investments and change the policies so that they can lead their lives to their full potential.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
So Tim's joining us now. Tim, you've been traveling with the Beto campaign. You're in Des Moines, Iowa right now. So that was a really wide-ranging interview. You touched on a lot of things. But I did not know about Beto O'Rourke's sister. And clearly, you know, she's playing a big role in his politics. What more can you tell me about his plan to address issues affecting Americans with disabilities?
Thank you for having me on. So Beto O'Rourke was actually the first candidate to speak about the disabled community on the debate stage. And last week he released a partial plan aimed at addressing the disabled community. And part of the partial plan deals with making sure disabled individuals receive long-term home and community-based services. And like he said in the interview, making sure we remove some of those barriers so they can be incorporated in regular American life, and also making sure that we strengthen the existing civil rights laws so that they are treated with dignity.
So let's talk a little bit more about his controversial plan that he floated, a mandatory gun buyback plan. He's taken a lot of criticism, not just from Republicans, but also fellow Democratic candidates really sort of took him to task about how he would pull something like that off. Talk us through how it would work.
So yeah, that's been part of the point of contention between him and Democrats like Mayor Pete Buttigieg, just the enforcement and how are you actually going to get these guns away from people. Yes, during the interview last night, he said that he won't be going door to door, he won't be, you know, taking those guns, and he's expecting Americans to hand them over. How that will work, we still don't know, but we know that he will be putting out a fine if Americans are caught out in the open with these guns, and if they continue to not give them up, he has said that there will be some criminal enforcement. We don't know what that enforcement looks like just yet, but we know that that is a possibility. He also talked about funding and how we will be able to finance buying these guns back, and he says that he will be levying charges on different companies that continue to make these AR-15s and sell them, and you know, try to sell them to Americans, which is interesting to me because he's not saying that companies cannot stop selling these guns, but people cannot buy them. So it's or cannot continue creating these guns, but people can't buy them, and he wants to buy them back. So there's still a lot to be worked out with the plan.
Yeah, that is interesting. Yeah, well, details. So 9 candidates.
Details.
Yeah,
Right.
and that's what counts. So 9 of the candidates have qualified for the next presidential debate. Beto O'Rourke is not one of them. What are your sources telling you about, you know, how the campaign feels about this? Are they worried moving forward?
They're surprisingly optimistic right now. They know that everything right now is kind of out of their power. There's still a few weeks left before the cutoff. I think the date is November 13th. But he has got 2 of the polls that he needs. He needs 2 more polls, and I think they're looking for some of these national polls. He actually just got a national poll this week. A CNN poll had him at 3%, and he just needs 2 more. But they're looking at some of these national polls because, as you remember, when he took time off after the El Paso shooting, he changed his campaign strategy, and instead of focusing on these early 4 states, New Hampshire, Iowa, South Carolina, and Nevada, he's going everywhere, and you see him going to states all across the country. And so he's hoping that that tactic will bring him up in some of these national polls and not really looking at some of these state-specific polls.
Yeah, well, you know, just because you don't make it to the debate stage doesn't mean you're out, but it sure makes the journey a lot tougher, especially when it comes to fundraising. Tim, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
So you can read more about O'Rourke's opioid plan and his gun buyback proposal on CBSNews.com.